Throughout human history, people have tried to conquer the seas in various ways, ranging from Og and his floaty log to battleships and beyond. Still, as nations developed along with their technologies and needs, they began to develop ships for special purposes, in terms of warships, of course, leading to the creation of some rather odd vessels. And one nation that certainly had their fair share of odd designs was the United Kingdom. The Royal Navy, due to the possible conflicts, overall strength, and material wealth, were able to create specialty ships for very specific purposes, and some overall unique designs. In today's video, we'll be looking at a couple of their weird and wacky looking ships from the First World War, as that's a period the channel tends to cover. If you have any suggestions for other ships, please leave them down in the comments. The first ships we're going to discuss are the Royal Navy Monitors. The idea of a small ship with a big gun and a shallow draft was a concept that can be roughly traced back to the Age of Sail, when British and French forces used bomb vessels at the end of the 17th century to bombard forts at places like Tripoli and Genoa. These vessels came into being for the Royal Navy in the 1690s, as Jim Crosley in Monitors of the Royal Navy, How the Fleet Brought the Great Guns to Bear writes, "The offender was the bomb ketch, a vessel copied from the French. Bomb ketches were small, shallow draft ships able to get close inshore. They were armed with a dastardly weapon, a large bore mortar, which threw an explosive bomb far up into the air so that it cleared the walls of warside cities or harbors and exploded when it struck the ground, damaging property, killing soldiers and civilians alike." In the Iron and Steam Age, these vessels came into being in the Crimean War and especially the American Civil War. With this in mind, in the stalemate of the First World War on the Western Front, the Admiralty in November 1914, now under the control of Admiral Jackie Fisher as the First Sea Lord and Winston Churchill as the First Lord, desired to find a way to break the stalemate that had already set in using the Grand Fleet. They wanted to strike Germany decisively in a vulnerable spot. Admiral Jackie Fisher had been a proponent of his Baltic project, where an offensive against the Pomeranian coast could enable a landing with Russian support only 90 miles from Berlin. For this to occur, the High Seas Fleet would need to be decisively neutralized or locked up in Wilhelmshaven. Not only that, the shallow water of the Baltic enabled it to be easily mined, meaning that the big gun battleships with their deep drafts would be at risk in such operations. The stabilization of the Western Front also offered possibilities to land in the Low Countries against German positions. We'll discuss the Baltic project more later on in this video. Another important factor that contributed to the development of the Monitors was the situation in the Mediterranean with the German battlecruiser Goeben and the cruiser Breslau, as they had sought refuge in the Ottoman Empire after bombarding French positions in North Africa and being chased by Royal Navy ships into the Eastern Mediterranean, something I discuss in my video on Indefatigable. The Ottomans were still trying to decide whether they were going to join the Central Powers. With Goeben and Breslau in the Ottoman Empire, there were opportunities to open the Dardanelles to get supplies and materials to Russia. And with the failure of the Royal Navy to catch the two German ships, there were those who wanted to avenge that failure. The Dardanelles Straits leading to Constantinople were narrow, shallow, defended by guns, could be easily mined, and quite frankly, no place for the big gun battleships the Allies, and specifically the Royal Navy, would need to send to control the straits. Britain did not have the ships to effectively and somewhat safely reach the enemy's strongpoints and strong shore defenses. What Britain did have were a lot of big guns from obsolete pre-dreadnoughts and/or ships that didn't need them anymore. An interesting point in the development of Royal Navy Monitors is in November 1914, when Charles Schwab, president of Bethlehem Steelworks, was on RMS Olympic and witnessed the sinking of HMS Audacious north of Ireland. Schwab was there to sell arms to Britain. Once Admiral John Jellicoe, the commander-in-chief of the Grand Fleet, had released him and the other passengers, he went on to London. He talked to the First Lord, Winston Churchill, who offered to sell him the 14-inch guns Bethlehem Steelworks was building for the Greek battleship Salamis in Germany. As long as the British blockade withstood, Schwab was perfectly content to sell them to Churchill, and the idea of the first British Monitors was conceived. These were to be the Monitors Abercrombie, Havelock, Ragland, and Roberts, not to be confused with the ones from the Second World War. Where to quote Big Gun Monitors, Design, Construction, and Operations 1914 to 1945 by Ian Buxton, By the standards of Ericsson's original design, the British concept was not strictly a monitor, but over the intervening half-century, the term could reasonably be considered as having evolved somewhat to embrace the new type, which still owed something of its characteristics to the first monitor. Within the Royal Navy, the description monitor would be distinctive and unambiguous, while not giving away too much as to their expected operational role. The Royal Navy first constructed those 4 14-inch gun monitors. Once realizing the rapidity with which the construction of those 14-inch monitors got underway, and with the coastal bombardment opportunities I had mentioned before, including the Dardanelles as the Ottomans had entered the war, it encouraged Churchill to plan further big gun monitors, telling Fisher about reserve 13.5-inch guns meant for audacious, as well as reserve 15-inch and 18-inch howitzers. Churchill hoped to have more out by the autumn of 1915. The 12-inch armed ship's design was little changed from the previous 14-inch gun monitors, having a draft of 10-foot and 15-foot bulges. If you want to talk about bulges, these are bulges. If you thought the ex-Norwegian coastal defense ships Glatten and Gorgon looked funny, these are awesome. Anyway, it was hoped the machinery could be diesel. However, that machinery was still in its infancy, and so not practical. Interestingly enough, the Roberts built in the Second World War was also considered for diesel. Still, for similar reasons, it was not practical as they needed to get that ship out as quickly as possible. Instead, these 12-inch monitors received steam reciprocators, giving them around 2,000 shaft horsepower, with steam provided by 2 boilers and a top speed a little under 10 knots. Since the armament was 367 tons lighter than the 14-inch guns, the hull could be made slightly narrower, also simplifying the issue of berthing these odd ships. And more important for the crew, the thickness of the sloping armor belt increased from 4 inches to 6 inches, resulting in a displacement of 5,600 tons as compared to the almost 6,000 tons of the earlier class. As you can see from this picture, the ships were pretty sparse, with only the main battery and a few smaller guns that were added on, the tripod mast, funnel, and other fittings on the forecastle deck, which ran 3/4 of the length of the ship. The aft section being open, providing space to arrange for the stowage of observation seaplanes, making monitors one of the first ships designed from the outset to carry aircraft. The upper deck was open at the sides, containing the galleys and wash places, together with the barbette structure surrounding the ammunition trunk of the turret. The lower decks were where the coal bunkers and machinery spaces were, magazine spaces, and the accommodation for the crew, which was about 200 men and not exactly roomy. The Royal Navy continued to develop monitors, creating further classes, some even armed with 15-inch guns, with a similar overall design to the previous 12-inch and 14-inch monitors, along with smaller monitors armed with a variety of guns, including 9.2-inch guns. The monitors went on to be used in various roles throughout the First World War. Still, they were mostly used to bombard positions throughout Europe, ranging from the Dardanelles campaign in the Ottoman Empire to the Dover Patrol in the English Channel, where monitors bombarded German positions in France and Belgium, most famously Ostend and Zeebrugge. The monitors were also used as testbeds for new technologies or guns, with the monitors Lord Clive and General Wolfe being used to test the 18-inch guns meant for another ship we will discuss, HMS Furious. The monitors were fairly successful in their careers, with some of the monitors like HMS Erebus, Terror, and Marshal Soult retained after the war, with Erebus and Terror seeing service in the Second World War, with 2 new monitors built, Roberts and Abercrombie. The Royal Navy monitors are some of my favorite ships to research, not only because of their interesting design, but because of their varied histories and overall oddities. I've done several videos on monitors, their links will be in the description. The next group of ships we will discuss is the courageous class of battlecruisers or large light cruisers, as their creator Admiral Jackie Fisher would call them. Like the monitors, these ships were created to assist in his Baltic project. It was one of several plans discussed by the Admiralty for using the Navy to break the deadlock of the armies on the continent. Other plans included landing troops on the Belgian coast and an assault on the Dardanelles, the preferred project of Churchill, which was eventually chosen to execute. There were other plans, including seizing islands near the German coast to either observe the movements of the German fleet or as a possible jumping-off point for an invasion of Schleswig-Holstein and the seizure of the Kiel Canal. That's all to say these plans were related to the Baltic project, as it gave the Grand Fleet access to the Baltic. But before it could transfer to the Baltic, the German high seas fleet would either need to be defeated or somehow be prevented from entering the North Sea. Fisher saw these large light cruisers, or light battle cruisers, as a support vessel for his Baltic project, which here is an excerpt concerning these vessels from an interesting letter Fisher wrote to Sir Eustace Henry William Tennyson Danecourt, the Director of Naval Construction, in March of 1915, to which I am getting from British Battlecruisers 1905 to 1920 by John Roberts. Fisher writes, "I've told the First Lord that the more I consider the qualities of your design of the big light battlecruisers, the more I am impressed by its exceeding excellence and simplicity. All the three vital requirements of gunpowder, speed, and draught of water so well balanced. Beardmore and Vickers, neither of whom was to build one of these ships, are sure they can produce 2 ships in 11 months, which alone is a testimony to the goodness of the design as regards simplicity. However, I fear we are not going to get even 2 out of the 4 owing to the parliamentary bugbear of delaying the 4 last ships of the Royal Sovereign type. It's a great pity, as it will be very greatly regretted." Now, the designation large light cruiser is an interesting one. As Fisher campaigned for more vessels, he described them as large light cruisers, but they would be better described as light battle cruisers, armed with 2 twin 15-inch gun turrets. The description of large light cruiser was employed to get cabinet and parliamentary approval because the construction of further battle cruisers and battleships had been vetoed. Still, the construction of light cruisers had not. Fisher also commented to Danecourt that these ships could be used against enemy cruisers that might reach the open seas to attack merchant ships, also describing the 18-inch gun Furious and how it would be used in his Baltic project, as well as possible 20-inch gun vessels for future projects, hoping that these large guns would be able to assist him in the invasion of Pomerania. Another interesting thing to note was the shallow draft, where in R.A. Burt's British Battleships of World War I, he describes the overall specifications Fisher wanted, writing, 1. Sufficient displacement to ensure maintenance of speed in moderate weather. 2. Draft restricted to allow operations in shallow waters at the entrance to the Baltic. Restriction of draft was to be approximately 5 feet 6 inches less than the average for a capital ship, and all other factors would be subordinated to this. 3. A powerful armament. 4. High speed, at least 32 knots to outsteam any enemy light cruiser. It was anticipated that the ship would be operating mainly in waters too shallow for heavy ships. 5. Protection to be on light cruiser standard, with 3-inch from the waterline to the forecastle deck. 6. Below water bulges for a considerable length amidships, and protected machinery and boilers kept as far inboard as possible and placed behind triple bulkheads. To get into the actual development of the Courageous class, their plans were submitted for approval in late January of 1915, essentially being reduced versions of the Renown class, with the removal of B-turret and hull armor reduced to a light cruiser. However, the ships enjoyed the adoption of small tube boilers and geared turbines, which would save weight and improve the efficiency of their machinery. Another change for Courageous and Glorious was that their bulkheads were increased to a uniform thickness of 1.5 inches, which would add 500 tons to their displacement and increase their draft as well as reduce their speed. With these changes to Courageous and Glorious, they were laid down in late March and April of 1915 respectively. While under construction, a major addition was that of deck plating following the Battle of Jutland, which would add 400 tons to their displacement. There were others as the vessels would come in 1,700 tons heavier than the original estimates, and no other later estimations survived. An interesting possibility was the change of the 4-inch mounts, with the triple 4-inch mounts being added. The particulars of the Courageous class as of the 28th of January 1915 would be 17,400 tons displacement, which would later be 17,800 tons, the machinery for 90,000 shaft horsepower with a top speed of 32 knots, an armament of 4 15-inch guns and 2 twin turrets, 16 4-inch guns, 2 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, along with 5 Maxim machine guns and 2 torpedo tubes. As for armor, they had side armor of 3 inches amidships, barbettes of a max thickness of 7 inches, maximum conning tower thickness of 10 inches, the turrets had a face thickness of 13 inches, the sides 11 inches, and the roof and rear of 7 inches, along with a torpedo bulkhead of 3/4 of an inch. As for Furious, Fisher saw her as a repeat of the Courageous class, and in reality, she would be more like a half-sister as compared to the other 2 vessels, being laid down in 1915 as well. Since her 18-inch guns fired much slower, Fisher looked for an improved secondary battery for the ship, where he found the 5.5-inch gun. With her aforementioned 18-inch guns, she would displace 19,200 tons with machinery for 90,000 shaft horsepower and a top speed of 31.5 knots. Her armament included two 18-inch 40 caliber guns with one in one turret forward and one aft, along with 8 5.5-inch guns, 3 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, 5 Maxim machine guns, and 2 torpedo tubes. Her armor layout was similar to that of the Courageous class, differing in the main deck thickness, having a maximum thickness of 1.75 inches. Courageous and Glorious would take around 18 months to build, with Courageous running trials in October 1916 and Glorious in December. Given the light construction of these ships, they had a fair number of issues. Like during Courageous's trials in 1916, she sustained structural damage while working up to full speed against a rough sea. Given their specialized nature, and with Fisher out of the picture as First Sea Lord in 1915, the Royal Navy had to figure out something to do with these ships. Courageous and Glorious had some prospects to work with the Grand Fleet, but Furious, on the other hand, she was way too specialized. Her 18-inch guns were very slow firing and not practical for fleet work, where I should say there is some evidence to say that her forward 18-inch gun was never fitted. Whatever the case, in February 1917, as the Royal Navy continued to experiment with aircraft at sea, the Grand Fleet Aircraft Committee recommended that the still being fitted out Furious would be of more use being completed as an aircraft carrier, since she would be able to embark a large number of aircraft and with her high speeds, be able to keep up with the battle fleet. Certainly an interesting proposal. Admiral David Beatty, now Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, who appointed this committee, gave some pushback saying that he wanted Furious to be completed to her original specifications. The committee felt that it was important to go through with the conversion, as it would only remove her forward turret and in its place give her a forward flying off platform. By July 4th, 1917, the ship was modified for this. Furious went through several more iterations before she was converted into a flush deck carrier in the 1920s, while Courageous and Glorious operated with the Grand Fleet in the First World War. With the successful conversion of Furious, the other two were prime candidates for conversion as well, as the Royal Navy needed more capable carriers during this period. Both Courageous and Glorious were lost during the Second World War, while Furious survived the war and was scrapped afterwards. Finally, we come to our last ship, HMS Agincourt. I know she wasn't originally built for the United Kingdom and a more standard battleship, but she was designed and built in British yards and would eventually serve in the Royal Navy. Plus, she's just so interesting. Anyway, to understand the history of HMS Agincourt, we have to understand the reason why she was ordered. Starting off life, she was planned to be the Brazilian Rio de Janeiro, as they were in a naval arms race with Argentina and Chile. In the first half of the 20th century, they had vast natural resources, notably rubber for Brazil. These nations were very well off, so much so they were building some of the most powerful battleships that money could buy. With this, the Brazilian government came to Britain and other nations' naval yards with great ambitions, wanting a battleship that carried the most powerful naval guns in existence to outdo the battleships the Argentinians or the Chileans were building or planning at the time. In the preliminary designs, they came up with designs over 30,000 tons and ships armed with 12 14-inch guns, 10 15-inch guns, or 8 16-inch guns. All of these proposed designs exceeded the financial means the Brazilians had at the time to procure such a vessel. The Brazilians chose the British yard Armstrong over the stiff competition from foreign yards. They ended up deciding on preliminary design 1 for the basis of their ship, displacing some 31,600 tons with a main battery of 12 14-inch guns. With this, the Brazilians would certainly have the most powerful dreadnought in South America. However, the Brazilian government that decided on this design soon fell out of power, and a new one put financial restrictions on their building program so they could focus on restoring order to the country. In the process, they canceled the contract that they had made with Armstrong. Now, Armstrong, wanting the contract to be fulfilled, sent out a party headed by Eustace Tennyson Danecourt, the future director of naval construction, with alternative sketches for another battleship that would be less expensive than the initial design the Brazilians had chosen. Still, this design mounted the most heavy guns ever put on a battleship until that point, with 14 12-inch guns. The Brazilian government very quickly accepted this design, and the battleship construction could get going. However, in November of 1913, the Brazilian government came under some more and this time even more severe financial strain due to less expensive rubber from Malaya that undermined the market value of Brazil's rubber. Only 10 months after the ship's launch, with doubts if Brazil could make the payments for the battleship, she would go up for sale. The battleship was quickly bought up by the Ottoman government for approximately £2,225,000. The ship was renamed Sultan Osman I. It would pair very nicely with the other dreadnought being built in British yards for the Ottoman Empire, the Reshidia, which was similar to the King George V class carrying 10 13.5-inch guns, although it did take inspiration from other classes as well. These two vessels were costing the impoverished Ottomans almost £6 million, with the money being raised through taxes, not paying civil servants, and finally donations from Turkish towns and villages, with women selling their hair to help pay for the battleships, making the nation rather invested in getting their hard-earned dreadnoughts. The Ottoman Navy was in somewhat of a revitalization, constructing a new fleet, hoping to counter the rapidly growing Greek one in the Mediterranean and the Russian one in the Black Sea, with the Greeks building a dreadnought in Germany and acquiring 2 pre-dreadnoughts from the United States, while the Russians were building the Empress Maria-class dreadnoughts. Before we continue with our story with the soon-to-be Agincourt, we should discuss the particulars of the ship. She was laid down in September 1911, launched in January 1913, and completed in August 1914. She had a full load displacement of 27,850 tons initially. As for machinery, she had 22 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, giving steam to Parsons direct drive turbines powering 4 screws, giving her as designed 34,000 shaft horsepower and a 22-knot top speed. As for armaments, she carried 14 12-inch 45 caliber guns and twin turrets along the center line of the ship, 26-inch guns, 10 3-inch quick-firing guns, 4 3-pounders, and 3 21-inch torpedo tubes. Her armor scheme called for a 9-inch main belt and an upper belt of 6 inches. Bulkheads, depending on the area, would vary between 3 inches and 6 inches. Decks would also vary between 1.5 inches and 2 inches. Barbettes had a maximum thickness of 9 inches. The main battery turrets had a face thickness of 12 inches, 8 inches on the sides, and 10 inches on the rear. The conning tower had a maximum thickness of 12 inches. She saw several changes throughout the war. Originally, she was designed with fewer 6-inch guns, but 2 were added by the British when she was seized. And the anti-torpedo nets were removed, the flying deck amidships, along with several other things. Notable additions throughout the war would be searchlights, along with improvements to the fire director control and some anti-aircraft guns late in the war. By July of 1914, the battleship was being fitted out for its new owner by the Elswick Yard, including taking off the nameplates carrying the instructions and the like, which were in Portuguese, fitting the Admiral's stateroom with mahogany paneling and other fineries, while the crew accommodations were made to fit the Turkish standards of living. Notably, the bathrooms were made appropriate for the Turkish style of squatting while using the restroom. It should be noted that not all of the 12-inch guns were in place by this time as well. With the July crisis continuing, the British Admiralty looked on anxiously as the 2 Turkish battleships were nearing completion. The Ottomans were even more anxious to get their 2 new battleships. Reshidia was finished in early July, but the British Admiralty advised that she stay in the United Kingdom until the Sultan Osman I could be completed and the 2 battleships could sail to the Ottoman Empire together. Meanwhile, the Admiralty was making suggestions to Armstrong and Vickers that there was no real need to hurry the delivery of these 2 vessels. However, the pressure mounted to deliver the ships, as on the 27th of July, an Ottoman passenger liner arrived in the Tyne, carrying 500 sailors for Sultan Osman I. The delivery into Turkish hands was expected on the 2nd of August, while on the 1st, the 13th 12-inch gun had been installed, and the 14th was expected later that day, but there was no ammunition aboard. Meanwhile, on the 31st of July, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, with war in Europe impending, informed the builders that the government intended to seize the ships, as they could not permit the ships to be handed over to a foreign power. There was a clause in the contracts that permitted the British government to buy back the ships in a national emergency, although the Ottomans were not likely willing to sell the ships. Armstrong feared that the Turkish captain and sailors might attempt to seize the ship and hoist the Turkish flag, so the following day, a company of soldiers with fixed bayonets marched on board, essentially seizing the ship. In Castles of Steel, Britain, Germany, and the Winning of the Great War at Sea by Robert K. Massey, he writes, "Churchill never apologized. The Turkish battleships were vital to us," he said later. "With a margin of only 7 dreadnoughts, we could not afford to do without these 2 fine ships." He attempted to patch up the damage by offering that at the end of the war, Turkey should receive either the 2 requisition dreadnoughts fully repaired or else their full value. He added that, in any case, Britain would pay Turkey £1,000 a day for every day that she kept them. The offer would stand so long as Turkey remained neutral. With that, Sultan Osman I was renamed Agincourt and commissioned on the 7th of August in Devonport with some of the guns still not in place. Eventually, with everything in place, she would sail to Scapa Flow, arriving on the 26th of August 1914 to join the rest of the Grand Fleet. Agincourt joined the 4th Battle Squadron of the Grand Fleet, where a rather inexperienced crew needed to train, being a rather eclectic mixture of raw recruits, sailors who had been convicted of minor crimes, and those who formerly crewed the royal yachts. The 4th Battle Squadron would consist of Dreadnought, Bellerophon, and several other ships, later to be joined by newer battleships, including the Erin, the former Reshidia. Now, as for Agincourt's career, there really isn't much to be said until the Battle of Jutland, where by that time she had transferred to the 6th Division of the 1st Battle Squadron, where she would be accompanied by the battleships Hercules, Revenge, and the flagship Marlborough. This unit could be described as a hodgepodge, as it was certainly the most diverse unit, as every ship was from a different class. Anyway, Agincourt participated in the Battle of Jutland, where she fired on the German battle line, including the Battlecruisers, although it's not clear if she hit anything. After the Battle of Jutland, much like before it, there isn't anything of great note to say besides escorting convoys to Norway and back to Britain, as well as being present at the surrendering of the High Seas Fleet at the end of the war. In March of 1919, she was placed in the reserve fleet at Rosyth, and in April of 1921, she was placed on the disposal list, but then used for experimental work. By December of 1922, she was sold to Rosyth's shipbreaking company. She would still be intact in 1924, and to comply with the Washington Naval Treaty, she was cut in half, and the 2 sections were taken out within 24 hours. I know this is a bit of a different video, and something that I've had milling around in my head for a while now. I know I didn't cover every odd ship or boat the Royal Navy constructed, or other nations for that matter. If you have any ship in particular you would like me to cover in the future, please put it in the comments. I plan on making this a series, so the more you put, the more ideas for the future. Anyway, thanks for watching everyone, I hope you all enjoyed it. Please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time my friends, have a great day.